Good. So, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. And I was very, very, very fascinated by the work you do, right? You are a neurologist, a neuroscientist, and you are currently the John C. Malone Professor of Neurology, Neuroscience, and Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and Director of the Brain Learning, Animation, and Movement Laboratory. And you co-founded the KATA project at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Welcome, John. Tell us a little bit what the Brain Learning Animation and Movement Laboratory is focusing on at the moment.
Well, we have a very wide range of projects, so I'm going to need to sort of divide them up a little bit. I mean, one area that we are heavily involved in is the study of skill and the effects of practice. In other words, we all know that practice makes perfect, but the biology and the neuroscience behind practice is actually still quite a mystery. So we're very interested in knowing what it is to get better at something, what's the best way to practice, and what's the difference between a skill and a habit, and what's the difference between expertise and a skill. So in other words, that's the direction that we are going in. Another interest we have is, you know, it's often considered different to be good physically and good mentally. So in other words, the idea that athletes are not intellectual, for example. So we don't think that's true at all. And so we're very interested in the interface between movement and thinking. And that's another area that we're very much involved in. So those are more theoretical questions. And then the other big direction we go in is sort of the biology of injury and recovery after neurological damage or illness. So we're very interested to know in both animal models and in humans, what happens after injury, how does the brain recover, and what should we be doing to help that? So that's another big area, brain plasticity, brain training, and the response of the arm and the brain to injury. So that's another big focus of BLAM Lab. And then you mentioned KATA, which is really a design studio, a sort of software and hardware design studio that we created that is attached in a sense to BLAM. And there we have artists and software engineers who are trying to build novel therapeutic experiences that could take advantage of the things we're finding out on the neuroscience side with respect to what happens after brain injury. So it's very synergistic, you know, the study of skill and learning, thinking and moving, brain plasticity after injury, and novel ways to try and promote recovery after injury. That's sort of the universe.
Interesting how you have fundamental research and applied research sort of really working in tandem, it seems like, then with the brain learning and mobility lab and the KATA design
Yes.
studio?
Yes. So that they're sort of different ideas. One is a more, in a sense, conventional human neuroscience lab, although I think what we do is innovative, obviously. And then KATA is quite new, which is to sort of bring engineering and artistic expertise into the human research space. So it's like a binary star, basically.
Fascinating. What is the current state of the art on brain and mobility and motility in clinical research?
You mean?
What are the main tendencies you see happening?
For rehabilitation, do you mean? In other words, do you mean for sort of
yes,
trying to train?
Of rehabilitation. And
yeah. So there are two big thrusts occurring in the last couple of years. One is to realize that patients need much more than they usually get after their stroke, for example. Okay, well, that's the overall awareness. The question then is how do you do that? Now, one way is you simply have the therapist do what they've always done, but just spend more time with the patient. Okay, so you just increase the number of hours available with the therapist. Okay, so for example, there are places now that have published where people can spend 6 to 5 hours a day with the therapist just to train their upper limb, right? That's, you know, usually you get about 15 minutes. So think of the difference, right? So that's one direction. Another one is to say, well, maybe we could use technology to sort of make that discovery more efficient so that you don't have to have a therapist spend that much time. Maybe you can concentrate it, amplify it, distill it with technology so that you can get that same benefit of more without having to exhaust the therapist or spend so much time. So those are the two directions. Now, I tend to be in the side that you should use technology to try and make that more efficient. And there, you know, one of the big areas that people tried was robotics.
The exoskeletons?
Exoskeletons, right. Now, you know, I've been somewhat of a critic of exoskeletons, and overall the research for them has been somewhat disappointing. I actually think, getting back to your point about basic and applied research happening at the same time, I think the conceptualization, the theoretical framework that was applied using robots was inadequate. And so the technology ran ahead of the actual biological theory, and that's why things didn't go as well as they should have. I think there's going to be a next generation of robots and a deeper way of thinking about how to use them, which means that they may potentially be a direction still that has promise. We haven't really used robots a lot. We think that you can use gaming and more practical forms of weight support of the arm that don't require buying an expensive robot. But at least both those directions involve immersive, enjoyable, quantifiable forms of intervention that I think will in the end prove to be more desirable on the part of the patient and on the part of clinical payers than just adding more hours of conventional therapy. So that's the sort of direction. And then on top of that, people are beginning to think of forms of brain stimulation, invasive and non-invasive. There may be new drugs coming that might enhance plasticity. So you can imagine having these technology platforms, and then on top of those platforms, you multiply with drugs and stimulators and other approaches. So there'll be a kind of combinatorial advance, is my guess. That's where things are going.
And beyond the rehabilitation too, in terms of you know, people wanting to improve their performance too, right? I think there is a big trend there.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In other words, you know, we wrote a paper back in 2009 on transcranial direct current stimulation that was quite influential because it basically enhanced skill learning in healthy subjects. Now, we were really doing it for scientific purposes, but you know, there are companies like Halo Neuroscience, which basically took these findings and commercialized them, as have others. So yes, I think there's a tension, which I've talked about before, between companies that are in this business that really want a consumer-facing, performance-enhancing technology for the healthy, but sort of sugar the pill with medical claims and for the ill. So I'm much more interested in finding, you know, health-related benefits rather than getting into the human performance enhancement business. But you're absolutely right. There's a deep subterranean connection between them.
And I think we'll see more. Millennials will be more into it because they are more into the quantified self too, right?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point you're making too, is, you know, when you think about technology, you have to think about it in terms of nudging. In other words, can it tell you, you know, go for a walk, eat your vegetables, sleep more? Measuring you, in other words, how many steps have you taken? How much sleep have you had? How, you know, potentially how stressed are you? and then maybe even in some cases, people claim that brain training can also be beneficial. So in other words, everything is in here, right? You're basically getting nudged, you're being quantified and assessed, you're being trained, perhaps you're being hooked up to your medical network. In other words, I think the quantified self is a really interesting thing. The question is will it end up being actionable? In other words, will it lead to true changes in behavior? In other words, changing behavior and changing behavior effectively in the long term is a lot more difficult than giving people measurements. And I think sometimes people feel like if you measure something, people will want to change something, and that doesn't actually follow, right? So you could argue, you know, the quantified self, will that lead to the behaviorally modified self? That's the question.
Indeed, indeed. What are your main sources of funding? Where does the industry or medical research, the National Health Institute?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we, over the years, have had
Private involved?
so we've had everything. Like we've had philanthropy, private foundation grants, internal grants and money from Johns Hopkins, NIH grants, National Science Foundation grants, grants from other kinds of foundations, like in sports, big Silicon Valley-like companies. So in other words, it's quite diverse. And then, of course, we span out from KATA, a startup company that was acquired by the Swiss unicorn MindMaze. And so, you know, also a lot of the work we were doing in KATA then got resources from the company. So we have actually done a lot of sort of hybridization between industry and academia and all those different sources. It's very important to be quite open-minded about funding, because when you're doing stuff that's slightly unconventional and new, you can't always rely on the traditional sources of funding in isolation.
And what are future applications of your research findings? We touched upon some. You already have part.
Well, I mean, I think you know, speaking to what you are asking, I would like to create, you know, scientifically based, highly immersive experiences that are sort of both cognitive and motor. In other words, develop a new kind of sport, right? So I'm very interested in that applied side. In other words, that's one. Two, we've just begun work on a monkey model of stroke, because there's a lot of stuff we don't understand about the deficit. So unfortunately, I think we are going to have an animal model, and I don't think mouse models, which I've also worked on, will do it. So another big thrust is to work on some kind of animal model of stroke. Another big direction is sort of thinking about more invasive forms of stimulation, potentially, for stroke. I mean, that's another direction that I'm beginning to get interested in. And then finally, the other direction is, as I said to you before, I'm very interested in long-term skill learning. In other words, what happens when you get better at something? What is a theory of practice? So those are sort of the four big directions that I think we're going in, actually.
And how do you work with industry? What are the ways you envision, and you have been working so far, but what are the ways you find that the lab can work with industries?
Well, for example, I'm on the scientific advisory board for Control Labs, which was a company that was sold to Facebook about a year ago. And we're working with them to study skill learning with their band, which detects muscle activation in the wrist. So that's a very good example, I think, of how one can work with industry. Then obviously having a startup that's acquired by industry is another way. So I think when it comes to human research, especially as you say, it blurs the boundary between enhancing performance in the well versus improving the sick. There are a lot of companies out there, and then of course the military, that are very interested in this kind of thing. So we're just learning as we go how to work both within the traditional academic environment and also work with industry, but we're doing it quite a lot. I mean, I have to say, some of it is more confidential than others, right? As you can imagine. Yeah, but yes, absolutely, we're doing that more and more. I think that's going to be the future, a little bit like, you know, what Media Lab did at MIT, right? That kind of concept in the medical space.
Yeah, indeed. And the role of the human body too, like we think of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and what about the actual body, right? Like, how do we work with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's another huge topic, right? In other words, a lot of people in the philosophy and the neuroscience side have this embodiment view that you can't really divorce cognition from the rest of the body, which is somewhat similar to the cognitive motor interface research we're doing. Of course, there's a lot of AI robotics going on right now. So some people are beginning to think that perhaps they're going to have to attach their computer, their deep neural net to a robot. So maybe that's the direction, and there are some people who believe that. The other point you're making, which I think is also true, is we're probably moving towards a hybrid model where, you know, the human body and the human mind combine with AI and robots, and it's not one substituting for the other, but you're like a team, right? So it's like having Luke Skywalker and R2-D2, right? It's having that hybrid approach, which is also coming, I think. So you're absolutely right. It's and then there's a whole bizarre transhumanism movement, right? Which is, you know, everywhere. You know, are you going to be downloadable into a computer? Can you be enhanced cyborg? Can you be frozen after your death? I mean, in other words, there's this huge fringe world centered on the body and aging, as you've probably heard about, that is.
And I'm particularly interested as I grow.
Yes, well, right. I mean, that's another thing, is a lot of the tech entrepreneurs
You know,
would,
attach it to my own brain.
what was that?
If I would change my body, just like have a new body completely, right?
Mm-hmm.
Purchase
Well,
myself, and then, but I have my brain, but my brain is building this body, right? My cognition, my understanding of the world happens through my everyday transactions and the habits that have been developed muscularly too. So would it be me still? No, probably not, right?
it's actually very interesting. You know, that's very
Type of thing.
it's a very interesting question. You know, there's been a tradition in the science fiction world, right, of body swapping, right? Whole TV series and movies about body swapping. And the idea always has been that if it's your brain swapped into someone else's body, it's you,
Right,
right?
right.
Um, I think your point is a good one, a very good one. I haven't really thought about it a lot. You know, how different would you be if you were in a different body? My guess is it would be a learning challenge. You'd have to learn how to live in a new body. But I think the human ability to learn, it would be like a skill. Instead of taking up tennis or the piano or the guitar, you would be taking up a new body. And you should consider it a skill just like any other. And you don't say it's not me because I'm learning how to play the piano. So I would say that you could just learn to control a new body the way you can learn tennis, and you would end up being fairly true to yourself, is my guess.
I know it's being out there a little, but it would be a better place. Sometimes we don't think that, but I think, you know, there are some things in terms of neuroscience research, and I think that could be fairly good to happen, and perhaps.
Because the opposite.
Elon Musk came up with this implantable chip, which has
Yes.
already, like, it has been tried, I think, in Sweden, right? They have companies that are using that, so the employees can walk in and out of the building. Well, that's something else entirely, but I'm saying there are more ways of sort of keeping track of people, keeping track of their movements, and also perhaps enhancing their abilities. Or
yeah, I mean, I'm you know, I've been interviewed quite a lot about the Neuralink technology. I think it would be completely unacceptable at this time to implant anything,
okay.
either for reading or writing from the brain. It's just completely, you know, they're going to do some research on spinal cord patients, I think. But the rest is just both scientifically, ethically, morally, completely to be explored. And it would be entirely premature to implant one of these things into a healthy person, in my view. Completely, far too premature. And, you know, in fact, at the Web Summit, right, I mean, Rafa Yuste and I did the interview about this. You know, you better be scientifically and ethically ready before you start playing these kind of games, is my view. But you're right that Musk, that's what he wants. I mean, he wants some consumer-facing implantable. But it's just, in a way, to me, not only premature, but a little irresponsible.
Yeah, we need the ethical people around it.
And the science isn't even ready. So
the science as well, it seems like it was criticized too, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it was more new hype than it was new science. But people respond, you see, that's the problem, is people love science fiction flavored advances in technology. It hypnotizes and seduces people.
Indeed. And, you know, the very fact that, you know, that the baby boomers now will be like 5 billion, right? Worldwide, 3 billion by 2050. So.
And, you know, in the baby boomers in the United States own about 65% of the wealth, right? So they have all the assets, and they want to live long enough to keep enjoying them. So there's tremendous pressure from the wealthy baby boomers to live longer, healthier lives and be enhanced technologically, and sort of not leaving very much for the millennials. It's very interesting to watch this slightly pathological use of wealth.
Oh, well. Well, thank you very much, John. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much for asking really good questions.